everybody. My name is Andrew Skog. Like Susan said, I work for MSA Professional Services. I've worked at MSA about 3 years. I'm a wastewater engineer, and I also dabble in the agricultural market occasionally. MSA, we're a municipal consulting firm, so I guess we would do anything really related to any engineering projects that a community might have, be that water, sewer, streets, highways, and another big market we do is wastewater. And so that's what I'm going to be mostly talking about today. I think it's a good transition point. We've kind of talked about the watershed as a whole and also some of the regulatory requirements, and now I think we're going to move on to wastewater treatment. So another thing I should say is MSA also has a growing agricultural sector in our company, and we work with, I would say we work with some of the small guys all the way up to the big CAFOs. I built a barn for a Mennonite in Greene County not that long ago, and also have done some CAFO work in Grant County. So with that, I guess I'll get started. One of the things we're going to talk about again is water quality trading, but first I'm going to give a little bit more background. We've already kind of greased the skids a little bit about some of the new phosphorus regulations in the state, so that'll be our first topic is new phosphorus regulations, how that affects wastewater treatment facilities, and then we'll talk kind of what my job is, which is going through all the different compliance options which are out there for these wastewater treatment facilities to comply with those new regulations. And then we're going to emphasize water quality trading and why we think it will be Broadhead's most likely compliance option, and how it may be another compliance option for other communities within this watershed. So with that, so Wisconsin's phosphorus rule, and again I said this is relatively new, but it actually is a result of some legislation that was passed in 2010, and what it did is it established numerical water quality criteria for phosphorus for our surface waters. So this, basically what that amounts to is all our streams got a new limit of 0.075 milligrams per liter, rivers are 0.1 milligram per liter, and all our lakes and flowages are usually less than 0.05 milligrams per liter, I believe. And so the reason this applies to wastewater treatment facilities is now that they have the new limits, if the stream is impaired, they need to discharge less than that limit. So why is this important? Why is it a big deal? As Mark had mentioned, these are really big requirements we're asking for our communities in terms of wastewater. In the past, typically, limits were based on the current technology, and so the typical limits would range between 1 and 2 milligrams per liter. And so now with these new regulations, we're asking people to go 10 times less than that, or order of magnitude less. So now we're talking 0.1, 0.075, 0.05, 0.04 milligrams per liter, which is a really big deal. And so the interesting thing is it's especially a big deal in the southern part of the state because a lot of the streams are impacted by non-point source pollution and agriculture. So a lot of them do not meet the criteria for phosphorus. So as a result, a lot of our wastewater treatment plants in the southern part of the state are going to get these new limits. And so I'm going to bring up the analogy just to kind of drive home the message of why it's so hard. And so the analogy I like to use is the minnow bucket. So I got my minnow bucket, and so I'm going to ask Rich, the DPW in Broadhead, what's your influent phosphorus to your wastewater treatment plant?
Leaving the plant?
Into the plant.
Into the plant, about 8 milligrams.
About 8 milligrams per liter. So if we make an assumption that there's 10 minnows represent 1 milligram per liter, how many minnows do you got in your bucket?
1 is 10?
Yeah, so you have 80, right? 80 minnows in his bucket. And so you'd think of the wastewater treatment plant as the minnow bucket, and the net in the picture there as the treatment technology. And so when you have 80 minnows in the bucket, it's really easy to scoop a whole bunch of those minnows out, right? And so the thing right now is, so currently the treatment plant, you got 8 coming in, so you got 80 minnows. And leaving, right now you're treating down to 0.8 approximately. So we're removing 10 times or 90% of the minnows in the bucket. So it's really easy with the current net to get those minnows out. Well, now, once we only have 8 minnows left, and the current limit now is you have to have less than 1 minnow in your bucket. And those are the super really hard minnows to get out of your bucket because they're really fast. Now you have to buy a new net, and that new net is really expensive. So that's what we're dealing with here, is that kind of idea that the farther we drive things down, just as Mark said, is you have this diminishing returns, and so you have to spend more money to get less out. So basically, there are the new rules. The good thing is that DNR gave communities a lot of different options to meet the new rules. And so this has kind of been my job for the last 3 years while I've worked at MSA. Actually, my first week, I actually came out to Broadhead and was working on optimizing phosphorus at the treatment plant. And we're not going to talk about all of these in super detail, just to kind of move things along today. But so you can see there's 7, really 8, two different watershed compliance options. And I guess to start, so just going down the list here, so regional treatment, the whole idea, the premise there is instead of taking on phosphorus compliance at your communities, you build a pump, a force main, and you send it to somebody else. So it's kind of like if Rich has the minnow bucket, instead of scooping everything out himself, he goes ahead and he gives his minnow bucket to another community. And they have to deal with it. So in most cases, that it probably is not the greatest alternative, at least for phosphorus compliance, because someone more than likely still has to deal with the phosphorus issue. So even though you give away your bucket, the person that you give your bucket to is going to charge you for that phosphorus compliance anyway. So typically only good for someone that, it would be a good option for maybe a small community or a community that had a really old wastewater treatment plant that needed to be upgraded. But I guess in the city of Broadhead case, that's not true. And so the other option is treatment and groundwater discharge. The reason this is a good alternative for some communities is the groundwater discharge method is not subject to phosphorus regulations. So potentially you can avoid the very stringent phosphorus limits by going to groundwater. One of the negative aspects of that is then you have to start worrying about nitrogen. And to do nitrogen removal can be very costly, and you also have to worry about, I guess, endangering the drinking water in terms of the nitrogen standards. So typically it's not a good option unless you're a very small community, and so probably not a lot of people are going to go that route. There's upgrading the wastewater treatment facility. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. There's these watershed compliance options, adaptive management, and water quality trading. We're going to talk about those a little more. And then there's a couple different variance options out there. One, I should also say you can also get site-specific limits. And that, I don't think there's a lot of communities that are going to go that route, but basically the premise is you would try to prove that even though the stream does not meet the phosphorus criteria, that the biological quality in the stream is still good. And so potentially some people might go that route. There's not a whole lot of guidance available right now, so it's not, I would say, a very popular alternative right now. As far as variances, there's 2. One is statutory economic variance, and that would apply to anybody that basically can't afford to do the treatment upgrade. Buying the new treatment technology, the new net for your minnow bucket, it's too expensive. And I would say there's going to be some people that fall into that category. More so would be the small communities. The last one, the statewide multi-discharger variance. This was recently passed. It's been sent to EPA. We haven't heard back yet. There's a lot of people out there that are looking forward to this variance happening. So there will probably be a lot of people going this route. It delays compliance with the new phosphorus criteria. And we'll talk about that variance a little bit more and why it's important to the Sugar River watershed. So, and I guess, so basically just kind of cross out the ones that really don't make a lot of sense for most communities. These are, I guess, the 4 that we're going to talk about a little bit more. So for upgrading a wastewater treatment facility, so to meet the new strict limits, basically the option for most plants is to just simply install a tertiary phosphorus system to remove phosphorus. Usually, if you have a limit less than 0.5 milligrams per liter, you're going to need to do something above and beyond what's typical. And the good thing is there are treatment technologies out there right now that can be used to meet this limit. We work with more small communities, and what we see is there's really 3 technologies out there right now. And so there's the list is right there. There's disc filtration, which is the one here on the left. Basically what you have is you have a series of discs with like a cloth media on them. And what you do is you pump a whole bunch of chemicals into the influent side. It goes into these discs. The water flows out. The phosphorus is trapped on the inside, and then the clean water flows out. Work really well. I would say as we go down the list here, these are probably the least costly. Over here we're more costly, but better treatment. The next one is the high rate clarification or ballasted clarification. These are really, I'm going to be a little bit of an engineering nerd here. These are really cool systems. They're really awesome. And so what the premise here is you add some chemicals, and you also add, they call it a ballasting agent. It's usually like a micro sand or magnetite. And so what's really interesting about these systems is when you add that combination of chemical and a very heavy solid, what you get is you get all the sediment to stick to the solid, and it's very easy to settle out because it's heavy. So that's how they work. And the really interesting thing about them is, like, I know there's a system out there called Comag that uses the magnetite, and they can actually recycle like 99.9% of the magnetite that they put in. So very little product is wasted. And I would say, like in Broadhead's case, that's probably the treatment unit that makes the most sense. Probably makes the most sense for most communities, just because it's very good at achieving less than a 0.1 milligram per liter final effluent. The last one here is upflow reactive sand filters. Basically, that is you add some chemical and you have some reactive sand, which allows the phosphorus to absorb and stick to the sand, and the clean water then flows up, or the dirty water comes in from the bottom, and clean water flows out from the top. Very good treatment. They are definitely harder to install, or more rigorous equipment needed up front of these processes. But so those are the 3 that are out there. So pros for upgrading the wastewater treatment facility: there's treatment technologies that can meet the new limits, and we know that they're really reliable. So we know if we install one of these systems, if it's designed correctly, we can meet the limit. So that's the big benefit. The cons are that it's very expensive, several $1 million for one of these projects. And the other thing to think about too is you're going to spend a lot of money on chemicals, and you're going to produce a lot of sludge, and you're going to use a lot of energy. So from that perspective, it can be a negative.
What happens to the sludge?
The sludge, so typically the sludge will be, it's wasted, and it's usually, in some cases, it's dewatered and land applied, or it can be, some people apply heat to cook it and can make a saleable product out of it. But more typical is you just put it in like a sludge storage tank, and you would pump it out once a year, twice a year, and apply it on ag fields is the most common. So there's a lot of sludge that goes out on our agricultural fields. So the next kind of big group of alternatives out there are these watershed, non-point source reduction alternatives. We've talked about those a little bit before today, but the whole idea is it's a voluntary compliance option that hopefully is cheaper, avoids a treatment facility upgrade, and maybe goes after, in a lot of our watersheds, we know that non-point source pollution is the dominant polluter per se. So it's kind of getting at, doing things in a different way, cheaper, and hopefully fixing actual water quality problems. The idea is that you would install different best management practices. These could be urban stormwater improvements, infiltration basins, stormwater ponds, leaf collection, things like that. Or on the ag side, we're talking nutrient management planning, barnyard improvements, livestock exclusions, contour buffer strips, contouring, all those kind of practices. And so there's two different compliance options. One is adaptive management, and the other one is water quality trading. And they both are very similar in the basic idea of going out into the watershed, but I guess I would say they're very different. So they're the same, but they're also totally different in how they're regulated. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But the main idea of both is that you're going to sufficiently install BMPs in the watershed so that you offset the amount of phosphorus that is discharged into the stream. And so one of the things that we have to consider is if we do this watershed approach is we're going to have to quantify either with a model or monitoring how much phosphorus we remove. Yeah.
Do you know the ratio between non-point and point source at all, and what makes up?
I would say it is definitely variable for every watershed. Obviously very dependent on how much stream flow you have, how big of a community, like if there's a big wastewater treatment plant on a small stream, you're going to have a high contribution from the point source versus the non-point. Vice versa, like in the Sugar River watershed, I would venture a guess that it's probably 90% dominated by, upwards of 90% non-point versus point source.
So there could be trillions and trillions of pounds of phosphorus coming from erosion versus a point source.
Yeah, and so one thing, so considering like the city of Broadhead, I want to say maybe discharges about 700 to 800 pounds of phosphorus annually. And the Sugar River itself, just downstream of the outfall, I would want to say has upwards of 90,000 pounds of phosphorus coming through annually. So like in Rich's case, the wastewater treatment plant makes up less than 1% of the total impairment to the stream. So, great question. So moving on here. So adaptive management. So adaptive management is, the whole idea is that the permittee is now going to be required to meet the stream criteria. So you can almost think of like Rich has his outfall pipe that he's measuring. Well, instead of measuring the results at the outfall pipe, now he's measuring the results in the stream. And so for streams, it's 0.075 milligrams per liter. For rivers like the Sugar River here in Broadhead, we're talking 0.1 milligram per liter. So as part of adaptive management, you're required to install BMPs to remove phosphorus. The other requirement is that you would have to meet these interim phosphorus limits in each permit term, and in wastewater world, each permit is about 5 years long. And so like Rich right now is at 0.8. And so if we were doing adaptive management, the next permit term, we would have to ratchet down our wastewater treatment facility a little bit to 0.6 or to 0.5 in the next permit term. And so in adaptive management, stream monitoring has to be done because you have to prove that you're complying. And the other thing that's really important is that you need to really prioritize where you install your BMPs, because your BMPs need to make an improvement in water quality, and if they're not doing that, you're wasting your money. The last thing about adaptive management is that there are some specific eligibility requirements. One is the stream has to be impaired for phosphorus. The other is that non-point source pollution must be at least 50% of the impairment. And trying to think of number 3. It's one of those things you're on the spot. Number 3. So we have. I'll have to get back to you on the third one. So as far as pros for adaptive management, potentially more cost-effective than other options. Potential for land management, water quality improvements out in the watershed instead at the wastewater treatment plant. And adaptive management also allows permittees more time to comply with the standard. Part of that is because we don't really know how this is all going to work yet. And so typically a permittee would be given like 15, 20 years, 3 to 4 permit terms to comply with water quality standards in the stream. The cons is that it's probably not practical in large or degraded watersheds. For example, here at the city of Brodhead, adaptive management really does not make sense just because the river here is so big. There's so much flow going through. It's really not, the stream is only, I think, moderately impaired. I think we could make that distinction. But the problem is that in order to bring it down to that criteria, it's a big investment. And based on our kind of preliminary calculations, it's about upwards of 27,000 pounds per year. So, which is a lot. It'd be a lot for, say, the city of Brodhead to by themselves go and get 27,000 pounds of improvement. Other things, one thing that's really concerning, I guess, from the adaptive management perspective is one of the things you have to deal with is if you do these practices in the watershed, we don't know really how effective those are going to be or how long it might take for those improvements to result in a water quality improvement. I mean, we were talking it might take 5, 10, 15, 20 years to see some of these improvements. So it's really hard to, I guess, measure success. The other thing is it might be difficult to find landowners who want to participate since it is a voluntary project. So water quality trading, and this is kind of more the focus of where we're going. The focus instead of the stream is now you're focused on how much phosphorus does the wastewater treatment plant discharge to the stream. And so if you think about it in your minnow bucket, if you're only allowed to dump 1 minnow into the stream, but you have 8 in your bucket, well, you now have to offset those 7 minnows that you have in your bucket. So that's the whole premise. The nice thing about this option is this, at least from if you do have like a degraded water or a very large system like we do here in Brodhead, is that you don't have to meet the water quality criteria in the stream to be successful. And just from a practical standpoint, that is a benefit to someone like Brodhead. Trades or BMPs can be implemented with point sources or private landowners. For example, say if the Albany wastewater treatment plant wanted to do a big upgrade and remove as much phosphorus as they possibly could, and they go about, say their limits here and they're able to get down here, they have this portion that they could then sell to a downstream point source, such as Brodhead. I think that probably isn't going to be very practical in this watershed, but it is out there. And the other option, again, is to work with private landowners or even do the urban stormwater work. So the really important thing to think about in water quality trading is that there's this trade ratio or a safety factor. And what this trade ratio or safety factor is meant to do is ensure that there is some kind of water quality improvement happening, even though we're not meeting the water quality criteria in the stream. So for example, trade ratios are typically 1.1 to 4 times the amount of phosphorus that would be discharged by the treatment plant. So if you think about it this way, if we had 100 pounds that we discharge above our limit, if we had a trade ratio of, say, 2 for stormwater practices, we would have to remove 200 pounds of phosphorus instead of 100. And so the whole idea is that even though we're not meeting the stream criteria necessarily, we're making water quality improvements. And another thing to note is, so that trade ratio, the magnitude of the trade ratio is based on how the perceived effectiveness of that BMP. So certain practices that we know will make a water quality improvement will have a lower trade ratio. And so from an economic standpoint, if you're a permittee that needs to implement trades, you're going to try your darndest to find the trades that do result in water quality improvement, because you will spend the least amount of money. So pros, the nice thing about water quality trading is there's no eligibility requirements like there is with adaptive management. No need to meet interim limits at the treatment plant. But on the other hand, there's definitely a benefit to still improving your discharge, because if you can ratchet that level of phosphorus down, you have less phosphorus that you need to offset. Stream monitoring is not required, which could be a cost savings. And again, just like adaptive management, water quality trading could be more cost effective than other compliance options like treatment. And there's potential for land management water quality improvements in the watershed. One of the cons to water quality trading is, although like adaptive management gave you more time to comply, water quality trading does not do that. Instead of having 15, 20 years, you would have maybe 7 to 9. So there's less time. And so in terms of like, that can make things more difficult. If you decide to do this too late in time, you might not have enough time to implement all your trades prior to your new permit. And just like adaptive management, another con is that it might be difficult to find landowners who are willing to participate. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the statewide multi-discharger variance in terms of the different compliance options. This, again, was a result of legislation from state of Wisconsin 2014, hopefully to reduce some of the economic impact on our small communities. The whole idea is that the permittee would now pay a fee instead of doing some kind of wastewater treatment plant upgrade or water quality trading or something like that. And so potentially they would allow that person to pay a fee in lieu of meeting the limit for up to 20 years. And as part of that, they would be required to still ratchet down their phosphorus discharge by, we're thinking it's 0.8, 0.6, 0.5 milligrams per liter in each permit term. The big issue right now is that it has not been approved by EPA, so we're not exactly positive how this variance is going to shape up. But I think if it does pass, there's going to be a lot of people in the state of Wisconsin that are going to go this route. Pros, less stringent interim limits, and definitely cost savings because you're pushing the big treatment plant upgrade down the road 20 years. So you're saving money that way. The con is that many communities will not be eligible. And for example, and this is based really on the economics of the state, there's certain areas of the state that I guess the state has deemed or maybe have too much money, or they're not economically impaired. So they don't get to do this variance, and it just so happens that Greene County and Dane County, which is where the Sugar River Watershed is not. At least the guidance documents, they don't let you go this route. So how does that, what does that mean for Broadhead and other municipalities in the Sugar River? Well, it probably means that you're either going to do an upgrade or you're going to do some sort of Nonpoint source project. And one thing I forgot to mention, so again, I mentioned adaptive management for like the city of Broadhead. We're talking 27,000 pounds of phosphorus removal. For water quality trading, because they do a pretty good job with treatment, and so in that case, we're talking like 1,600 pounds. So much less phosphorus need to be removed, so it's more economical. But so Sugar River Watershed as a whole, though, I would expect there's going to be a lot of people that are talking about wastewater treatment facility upgrades or adaptive management or water quality trading. And I guess just a little bit more background on what we've been doing at the city of Broadhead. So they currently have a limit of 1.7. They're going to be put down to 0.1. They treat waste, obviously from the residents of the city of Broadhead, but they also have a lot of hauled-in waste like leachate, landfill leachate, and septic hauling. So those are things that make the treatment process a little bit more difficult, I would say, puts a little bit more variability. And currently, they remove phosphorus. They have a biological treatment process with basically a chemical process as backup. And for anybody that's a wastewater nerd, biological phosphorus removal is really cool because basically you get the microorganisms in your wastewater to remove the phosphorus for you, and you don't have to spend as much money on chemicals. And so I guess a kudos to Broadhead for doing that. It's really cool. Again, we talked a little bit earlier, 8 milligrams per liter in, 0.8 milligrams per liter out, and we're getting about 90% removal. So their permit was reissued in 2012. Sugar River is above the criteria, so they got a 0.1, like we talked about. And so what we're doing right now is we have this 5-year window to decide what compliance option we're going to go with moving forward. And what it looks like, again, we basically have narrowed it down between treatment and trading, and we're going to have to make a decision within the next year by 2017 which of those we're going to do. And we would then have to comply with our new limits by 2019. And so this is just our preliminary cost estimate of treatment versus trading. And so try not to focus too much on this column, but really focus on this estimated present value. The present value takes into account the actual installation costs of the alternative plus the annual operation and maintenance costs. So it's the true value of what you're paying for. And so in terms of the wastewater treatment facility upgrade, we think that's going to be about $5.3 million. And then preliminarily, we've estimated that we could do it much cheaper for trading at 3.7. And I would say that the $5.3 million, that's a really good number. And as far as water quality trading, I would say that's a very conservative number on the high end. I think if we do some very minor upgrades at the wastewater treatment plant, we could maybe knock that down upwards of $1 million. So there's potential that water quality trading could be very, very beneficial for the city to pursue. And so, as it seems right now, that's what we're going with to date. So what we've started doing is we've looked at we're looking at two things. We're looking at doing some kind of trades in the city, and looking at stormwater improvements. And so we have just kind of a list. Here's a map of the storm sewer. So we're looking at that, and then we're also looking at out in the watershed. We've been talking with Greene County. Hopefully we can partner with them to do this project. And right now we're really looking at the feasibility of this and seeing how it will all work. The map there on the right is kind of our identified priority action area. There is some benefit to you don't want to go too far upstream from your outfall location because there is some additional trade ratios that you would have to pay for if you're really far away. So we try to tighten it just upstream, about 1 Huck 12 away from the outfall. So this is what we're working on, and that's really it. So I guess I don't know if we should just wait for questions for the panel or.